Chapter 1, The Architecture of Silence. The Monday morning briefing began like every other Daniel Carver had attended in his 7 years at the National Security Archive, with coffee that tasted like burnt cardboard and a conference room that smelled faintly of industrial carpet cleaner. He sat in his usual chair, third from the left, and watched his colleagues filter in with the resigned posture of people who'd made peace with fluorescent lighting and climate control set to perpetual autumn. Daniel was 34 years old, though the gray threading through his dark hair suggested someone who'd borrowed extra years from a harder life. He hadn't. His life had been, by most measures, unremarkably steady. Master's degree in information science from Georgetown. 6 years as a research analyst at a think tank before moving to the archive. An apartment in Silver Spring with walls the color of eggshell and furniture from IKEA that he'd assembled mostly correctly. A girlfriend named Sarah who worked in nonprofit development and who'd been dropping increasingly specific hints about moving in together. It was a life built on the foundation of documentation, verification, and a careful cataloging of what had already happened. Daniel's job was to process declassified government documents, to organize, analyze, and prepare them for public access. He worked with history that had already been written, already been lived, already been sealed away until time or litigation pried it loose from the government's grip. He found comfort in the past tense. Things that had already happened couldn't hurt anyone anymore, or so he'd believed. "All right, let's get started," said Margaret Chen, the archive's deputy director. She stood at the head of the table with a tablet in one hand and reading glasses dangling from a chain around her neck. Margaret was in her late 50s, with the efficient grace of someone who'd learned to navigate bureaucracy the way sailors navigate by stars, with patience, precision, and an understanding that some forces were simply immutable. "We've got a new batch coming in from State Department, late Cold War-era material," Margaret continued, scrolling through her tablet. "Standard procedure, nothing exotic. Daniel, I'm putting you on point for the initial assessment. Should be about 40 boxes, mostly cables and diplomatic correspondence from European posts, 1982 to 1987. Daniel nodded, making a note on his legal pad. 40 boxes meant weeks of work, maybe months depending on how much redaction review was needed. It meant hours in the temperature-controlled archive room, wearing the cotton gloves, carefully turning pages that smelled like old paper and government ink. It meant building spreadsheets, writing summaries, cross-referencing names and dates and events that mattered to people who were now retired, dead, or trying to forget. It meant exactly the kind of work he'd signed up for. "There's also something else," Margaret said, and the shift in her tone made Daniel look up. She'd set down her tablet and was looking directly at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Last Friday afternoon, we received an unusual request through FOIA. Someone's asking for documentation related to something called Project Sapphire Sky. The name doesn't appear in any of our standard indexes, but the request specifically cited document classification codes that would put it in your area, signals intelligence and diplomatic communications from the mid-1980s. "Never heard of it," Daniel said, which wasn't unusual. The government had a limitless capacity for naming programs, operations, and initiatives that vanished into the classified void. "Neither had anyone else here," Margaret replied. "Which is why I need you to do some preliminary digging before we respond to the request. Check if we have anything in the incoming State Department material. Run the name through the databases. See if it cross-references with anything else from that period." "Who submitted the FOIA request?" Daniel asked. Margaret glanced at her tablet. "A journalist. Elena Vasquez, writes for the Sentinel. Investigative reporting, government accountability, that sort of thing. She's got a good reputation, won the Polk Award a few years back for a series on CIA black sites." Daniel wrote down the name, though he already knew he'd remember it. Elena Vasquez. The Sentinel. Project Sapphire Sky. The words had the quality of doors not yet opened, of questions not yet asked. The meeting continued, budget discussions, upcoming conferences, someone's retirement party scheduled for next month, but Daniel's attention had already shifted. He found himself thinking about sapphires, about sky, about what kind of operation would get named something so seemingly innocuous and then disappear so completely that not even an archive dedicated to preserving classified history had heard of it. After the meeting, he walked back to his office, a shared space with 2 desks, for filing cabinets, and a window that looked out onto a parking lot where the same cars sat in the same spots every day like chess pieces that had forgotten how to move. His office mate, Tom, was already there, hunched over his computer in the aggressive posture of someone losing an argument with a database. "New project?" Tom asked without looking up. "Maybe," Daniel said, settling into his chair and waking his computer. "You ever hear of something called Project Sapphire Sky?" Tom finally turned, his face showing the particular expression of someone mentally cataloging decades of obscure government programs. Tom was 47, had been at the archive for 15 years, and possessed the kind of institutional memory that made him either invaluable or insufferable depending on the day. "No," Tom said after a moment. "And I know most of the exotic names from the 80s. That was peak creative nomenclature. Cold War was winding down, everyone was trying to justify budgets with programs that sounded important. But Sapphire Sky? No. That's new to me." Journalist filed a FOIA request asking about it. Tom's eyebrows rose. "Which journalist?" "Elena Vasquez, from the Sentinel." Tom whistled low. "She doesn't waste time on nothing. If she's asking about it, it's real." Daniel nodded slowly, feeling something shift in his chest, not quite excitement, not quite anxiety. Something in between. The sensation of standing at the edge of something without knowing how far down it went. He spent the rest of the morning doing exactly what Margaret had asked, running searches, checking databases, looking for any mention of Sapphire Sky in the indexes and finding lists they maintained. He found nothing. It was as if the name had never existed, had never been typed into any cable or memo or report that had passed through official channels. But absence, Daniel had learned, could be its own kind of evidence. Chapter 2, The First Thread. The 40 boxes from the State Department arrived on a Wednesday afternoon, delivered by an unmarked van and 2 men in dark suits who checked Daniel's credentials 3 times before wheeling the archive containers into the receiving room. Each box was sealed with tamper-evident tape and labeled with classification codes that had expired decades ago, transforming secrets into history through nothing more than the passage of time. Daniel began the intake process the next morning, working methodically through the chain of custody paperwork, photographing each seal before breaking it, logging every box into their tracking system. It was tedious work that most people would find unbearable, but Daniel had always found a strange meditation in the ritual of it, the careful documentation of documentation, the preservation of preservation. Box 7 contained what he was looking for, though he didn't realize it at first. The cables were arranged chronologically, each one a thin sheet of paper covered in the distinctive typewriter font of 1980s diplomatic correspondence. Most were routine, visa applications, trade discussions, cultural exchange programs. The mundane machinery of international relations, preserved for a posterity that would likely never care. But halfway through the box, Daniel's hands stopped moving. The cable was dated March 15, 1985, sent from the U.S. Embassy in Brussels to the State Department in Washington. The subject line read, "Request for Guidance re, Allied Concerns, Project SS." Most of the text had been redacted, thick black lines obscuring full paragraphs. But fragments remained, floating in the white space like survivors of a shipwreck. Allied intelligence services expressing reservations about scope and potential blowback. Technical capabilities exceed original authorization. Recommend immediate review of SS protocols before. The cable was signed by someone named Theodore Raines, Deputy Chief of Mission. Daniel read it 3 times, his pulse quickening with each pass. SS could mean anything, it was one of the most common abbreviations in government documents. But the date was right, the subject matter suggested something operational and controversial, and Allied concerns meant it crossed international boundaries. He pulled out his phone and photographed the cable, then continued through the box with renewed focus. 20 minutes later, he found another one. This cable was dated April 2, 1985, from the embassy in Bonn. Same sender, Theodore Raines, though now he was listed as being on temporary assignment to Germany. The subject line was more direct: SS status update and incident report. Again, heavy redaction. But again, fragments. Unauthorized access to facilities in Ramstein. 3 personnel placed on administrative leave pending investigation. West German Interior Ministry demanding explanation. Urge consideration of shutdown protocols. Daniel sat back in his chair, staring at the cable. His mouth had gone dry. Unauthorized access. Personnel investigations. A German ministry demanding explanations. This wasn't routine diplomatic business. This was something that had gone wrong, badly enough that a senior diplomat was sending urgent cables back to Washington, badly enough that someone had taken a black marker to most of the details 30 years later. He spent the next hour searching through the remaining boxes with surgical precision, looking for any cable signed by Theodore Raines, any reference to SS, any communication from Brussels or Bonn during that spring of 1985. He found 4 more cables, each more heavily redacted than the last, each suggesting an operation spiraling towards some kind of crisis. The final cable was dated May 9, 1985. The subject line was stark: SS termination and containment measures. Almost the entire text was blacked out. Only the first sentence and the last remained visible. In light of recent developments and at the direction of the Deputy Secretary, Project Sapphire Sky is hereby terminated effective immediately. And at the bottom, all documentation to be reclassified under UMBRA protocols. No further discussion via standard channels. Daniel photographed this cable as well, his hand surprisingly steady despite the adrenaline now flooding his system. Umbra was a classification level he'd only encountered a handful of times. It meant signals intelligence of the highest sensitivity, the kind of material that stayed classified long after everything else had been released. Someone had tried to bury Project Sapphire Sky as completely as possible. He looked at the time, 4:30 in the afternoon. Margaret would have left for the day, and Tom was at a conference in Boston. The archive room was quiet except for the hum of the climate control system and the distant sound of traffic outside. Daniel opened his laptop and composed an email to Margaret, attaching photos of the cables and providing a brief summary of what he'd found. His fingers hesitated over the send button. Once he sent this, once he officially reported that Project Sapphire Sky was real and that something had gone seriously wrong with it in 1985, he would be setting something in motion that he couldn't stop. But that was his job, wasn't it? To bring classified history into the light. To make sure that what had been hidden could be known. He clicked send. Then he sat in the silence of the archive room, surrounded by boxes full of old secrets, and wondered why his hands were shaking. He'd found controversial material before, had processed documents about covert operations and diplomatic scandals and programs that had exceeded their authority. This shouldn't feel different. But it did. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Daniel gathered the cables, placed them in a secure folder, and locked them in his desk drawer. Before leaving, he did something he'd never done before in 7 years at the archive. He looked over his shoulder to make sure no one was watching. The feeling followed him all the way home, riding in the passenger seat of his Honda like an uninvited guest. The sensation that he'd found something he wasn't supposed to find, that he'd pulled a thread that someone, somewhere, had hoped would stay forever buried. Chapter 3, The Pattern Emerges. Margaret's response came at 6:43 the next morning, while Daniel was still drinking his first coffee and staring at the CNN homepage without really reading it. The email subject line was simple: "Come see me when you get in." He arrived at the archive 20 minutes early, his shirt still wrinkled from being pulled too quickly from the dryer. Margaret's office door was already open, and she was standing by her window with her back to the hallway, holding a mug that said, "Information wants to be free," in fading letters, a gift from some long-ago conference that she'd kept for reasons Daniel had never asked about. "Close the door," she said without turning around. Daniel did, then stood awkwardly near the guest chair, waiting. Margaret turned, and he saw that she looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the early hour. It was the tiredness of someone who'd spent the night remembering things they'd tried to forget. "I made some calls last night," she said, settling into her chair and gesturing for Daniel to sit. "People I know who were working in the intelligence community in the mid-80s. Calling in favors, asking careful questions. And Project Sapphire Sky was real. Very real. And very, very sensitive." She paused, taking a slow sip from her mug. It was a Joint Signals Intelligence Operation, NSA, CIA, with cooperation from British and German intelligence. The official purpose was monitoring Soviet communications through a new satellite network. State-of-the-art for its time. Daniel waited, knowing there was more. But there was an unofficial component, Margaret continued, her voice dropping lower. They were also intercepting Allied communications. Monitoring our own partners, France, Italy, smaller NATO members. Looking for any signs that Soviet intelligence had penetrated Western governments. Looking for leaks, for moles, for anyone who might compromise the operation. "Jesus," Daniel said quietly. "It gets worse." In early 1985, someone within the operation started finding evidence of something else entirely. Not Soviet penetration, American wrongdoing. Weapons deals that violated international agreements. Black budget money being funneled to regimes that Congress had specifically forbidden us from supporting. Arms going to both sides of conflicts in Central America, the Middle East, Southeast Asia. Margaret set down her mug and opened a folder on her desk. Inside were printouts, not of the cables Daniel had found, but of other documents. Memos, meeting minutes, correspondence between agencies. None of it was supposed to be here. "One of my contacts sent these," she said, sliding the folder across the desk. "Off the record. He'll deny it if anyone asks. But he thought we should know what we're dealing with." Daniel opened the folder with trembling fingers. The first document was a memo dated February 1985, from someone at the CIA's Directorate of Operations to the Deputy Director. The subject line, "Sapphire Sky Data Anomalies, Request for Containment Assessment." The text was clinical, almost boring in its bureaucratic language. But the meaning was clear. Analysts working on Project Sapphire Sky had intercepted communications that revealed illegal arms transfers, money laundering through diplomatic channels, and cooperation between U.S. intelligence and criminal organizations. The evidence was extensive. The exposure would be catastrophic. "They found proof of crimes," Daniel said, looking up at Margaret. "And instead of reporting it, they classified it," Margaret finished. "They took evidence of wrongdoing by senior officials in multiple agencies and they buried it under the highest classification levels they could find. Then they shut down the entire operation, scattered the personnel, and made sure that anyone who knew the truth understood that speaking about it would be considered a breach of national security." Daniel flipped through the other documents. There were transcripts of intercepted calls, financial records showing money flowing through shell companies, even photographs of meetings that weren't supposed to have happened. All of it marked with classification stamps, all of it locked away where congressional oversight committees would never see it. "Theodore Raines," Daniel said suddenly. "The diplomat who sent those cables. What happened to him?" Margaret's expression darkened. "He died in a car accident in 1987. Single vehicle collision on a rural road in Virginia. The investigation concluded he'd fallen asleep at the wheel. The implication hung in the air between them, heavy and terrible." "How many people knew?" Daniel asked. "My contact estimates maybe 30 people saw the actual evidence. Most of them have died or retired. A few are still working in government, still bound by their security clearances, still too afraid to talk. And Elena Vasquez somehow found out about it." Margaret nodded. "Which means someone talked to her. Someone who was there, or someone who found documents that survived the purge." And now she's filed a FOIA request, which creates an official record that she's asking questions. Daniel sat back, his mind racing through the implications. So what do we do? Officially, we process her request according to standard procedures. We conduct a thorough search, we document what we find, and we provide whatever can legally be released. Margaret's voice was steady, professional. But Daniel, you need to understand something. There are people who believed then, and still believe now, that what happened with Sapphire Sky was necessary. That exposing it would damage national security, undermine trust in institutions, maybe even get people killed. And do you believe that? Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring at something beyond Daniel's shoulder. I believe that secrecy is sometimes necessary, she finally said. And I believe that secrecy is sometimes a weapon used by powerful people to protect themselves from accountability. The hard part is knowing which is which. She closed the folder and slid it back across the desk. Keep digging through those State Department boxes. Document everything you find. Follow procedure exactly, no shortcuts, no deviations. If this goes where I think it's going, we need to be absolutely unimpeachable. Daniel stood, picking up the folder. His legs felt unsteady, as if the floor had become less solid beneath him. Margaret, he said at the door, are we in danger? She looked at him with eyes that had seen 30 years of classified secrets, of buried histories, of truths that powerful people wanted to stay hidden. I don't know, she said. But from now on, you document everything. Keep copies of everything you find somewhere safe, somewhere outside this building. And Daniel? Be careful who you talk to about this. Trust is a complicated thing in this line of work. Chapter 4, The Weight of Truth. The call came on a Tuesday evening while Daniel was heating up leftover Thai food in his apartment microwave. An unknown number, which he normally wouldn't have answered, but something made him pick up on the third ring. Daniel Carver. The voice was female, professional, with the slight vocal fry of someone in their 30s who'd grown up watching too much cable news. Who's asking? Elena Vasquez. From the Sentinel. I think we need to talk about Project Sapphire Sky. Daniel's finger hovered over the end call button. Margaret's warning echoed in his mind, be careful who you talk to. But another part of him, the part that had chosen this career specifically because he believed in transparency, in the public's right to know, kept his hand frozen in place. I can't discuss ongoing FOIA requests, he said carefully. I'm not asking you to. I'm asking you to meet me. Tomorrow, lunchtime. There's a place called Moretti's on Columbia Road, quiet, good for conversation. 1 o'clock. Why would I do that? There was a pause, and when Elena spoke again, her voice had lost its professional polish. She sounded tired, and something else, frightened, maybe. Because 3 days ago, someone broke into my apartment. They didn't take my laptop or my TV or my jewelry. They took my notebooks. Specifically, the notebooks where I'd been documenting everything I'd learned about Sapphire Sky. Because 2 weeks before that, one of my sources, a former NSA analyst who was willing to talk on background, stopped returning my calls. His wife told me he'd had a sudden heart attack. He was 52 years old and ran marathons. Daniel felt his chest tighten. I'm sorry, but... And because I know you found the cables, Elena continued. I have a source inside the State Department, someone who knew those documents were about to be transferred to your archive. Someone who's just as scared as I am but who believes this story needs to come out. So please, Mr. Carver. 1 hour. Just listen to what I have to say. After that, if you want to walk away, I'll never contact you again. Daniel closed his eyes. The microwave beeped insistently, announcing that his pad thai had reached the optimal temperature for consumption. Through his apartment window, he could see the ordinary evening activities of his neighbors, someone walking a dog, someone else taking out recycling, the mundane choreography of safe, predictable lives. 1 o'clock, he said. But if you record this conversation. No recording. Just two people talking. Thank you, Daniel. She hung up before he could change his mind. He didn't sleep well that night. Around 2 in the morning, he got up and went to his closet, pulling down a box from the top shelf that contained old college textbooks he'd been meaning to donate for years. He removed the books and placed inside the box copies he'd made of the sapphire sky cables, along with photographs he'd taken of the documents Margaret had shown him. He'd been making copies of everything, storing them on an encrypted thumb drive that he kept in his sock drawer, but now that seemed inadequate. Too easy to find. Before dawn, he drove to Sarah's apartment. She answered the door in an oversized Amnesty International t-shirt, her hair pulled back in a messy bun, looking concerned and beautiful and completely unprepared for what he was about to ask her. "I need you to keep something for me," he said, holding out the box. "Don't open it. Don't look inside. Just put it somewhere safe, somewhere no one would think to look. Can you do that?" Sarah took the box, her face showing the mix of confusion and worry that had been appearing more frequently in their conversations lately. "Daniel, what's going on? You've been different the past 2 weeks. Distant. You barely talk about work anymore, and when you do, you look like..." "Like what?" "Like you're scared. Like you've seen something you can't unsee." She set the box down on her entryway table and took his hands. "Talk to me. Please." He wanted to. God, he wanted to tell her everything, about the cables, about Rains and his suspicious accident, about Margaret's warnings and Elena's break-in and the growing certainty that he'd stumbled into something much larger and more dangerous than a simple historical research project. But telling her would make her part of it, would put her at risk in ways he couldn't fully calculate. "I'm working on something sensitive," he said finally. "That's all I can say right now. But if anything happens to me..." "Daniel, you're scaring me. I know. I'm sorry. Just keep the box safe. And if I don't contact you for more than 3 days, if something happens and you can't reach me, take it to the press. Take it to the Washington Post or the New York Times. Tell them it's about Project Sapphire Sky. Can you remember that? Sapphire Sky." She repeated it back to him, her voice small and frightened. He kissed her forehead and left before she could ask any more questions he couldn't answer. Moretti's was exactly as Elena had described, a small Italian place with checked tablecloths and an older waitress who looked like she'd been working there since the Carter administration. Elena was already seated in a corner booth when Daniel arrived, her back to the wall in a way that seemed calculated. She was younger than he'd expected, maybe 30, with dark hair pulled into a practical ponytail and the kind of face that looked friendly until you noticed the intensity in her eyes. "Thank you for coming," she said as he slid into the booth across from her. "I ordered you a coffee. Hope that's okay. Let's skip the pleasantries. What do you want from me?" Elena pulled out a thin folder from the messenger bag beside her. "I want to show you something. I want you to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. And then I want to ask for your help." She opened the folder. Inside were photographs, not of documents, but of people. Government officials, military officers, businessmen in expensive suits. Some of the faces Daniel recognized from news coverage over the years. Others were strangers. "These are the people who knew," Elena said quietly. "The people who were part of Sapphire Sky or who were briefed on what it found. I've been building this map for 8 months, connecting dots, following money trails, tracking careers and connections." Her finger traced lines between photographs that had been drawn in red ink. 7 of them are dead. Car accidents, heart attacks, 1 suicide. All within a 5-year period after the project shut down. "That could be coincidence," Daniel said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Could be. But here's the thing, the 3 who are still alive and still in positions of power. They've all benefited enormously from keeping this buried. One is now a defense contractor CEO whose company has gotten billions in no-bid contracts. Another is an undersecretary of state. The third just got appointed to a federal judgeship. She pulled out another sheet, covered in financial transactions highlighted in yellow. And they're all connected to the same companies that profited from the illegal arms deals that Sapphire Sky uncovered. Daniel stared at the documents, feeling the last pieces of his old understanding of the world crumble away. This wasn't just historical wrongdoing. This was ongoing corruption, a system that had protected itself by burying the evidence and silencing anyone who threatened to expose it. What was really being sold, he asked. The cables mentioned weapons, but they never specified what kind. Elena's expression darkened. Chemical weapons precursors. Advanced military technology that was supposed to be restricted. And something else, something I haven't been able to fully verify yet, but my source says it involved nuclear materials. Small amounts, but enough to build dirty bombs or to jumpstart a weapons program. Chapter 5, The Price of Light. The story broke on a Thursday morning, 3 weeks after Daniel's meeting with Elena. He was at his desk, reviewing another box of cables, when his phone started vibrating with news alerts. The Sentinel's homepage loaded slowly, as if the servers were being overwhelmed by traffic, and then there it was, spanning the full width of his screen. Project Sapphire Sky, How U.S. Intelligence Buried Evidence of Illegal Arms Deals for Decades. By Elena Vasquez. Daniel's hands went numb as he scrolled through the article. She'd done it, she'd published everything. The cables he'd found, corroborated by documents from other sources she'd cultivated. The names of officials involved, carefully sourced and verified. The financial trails showing how money from illegal weapons sales had been laundered through legitimate companies. The suspicious deaths of people who tried to speak out. His phone rang. Margaret. My office. Now. The walk down the hallway felt like moving through water. When he entered, Margaret was standing at her window again, but this time there were two other people in the room, a man and a woman in dark suits that screamed federal law enforcement. Mr. Carver, the man said, I'm Special Agent Morrison with the FBI. We need to ask you some questions about classified materials that appear to have been leaked to the press. The next 6 hours were a blur of interrogation, of carefully parsed answers, of Daniel explaining over and over that he had followed proper procedures, that everything Elena had gotten from him was either already declassified or obtained through her own sources. The agents were professional but relentless, circling back to the same questions from different angles, looking for any admission that he'd knowingly disclosed classified information. Through it all, Margaret sat beside him, occasionally interjecting with reminders about his rights, about proper procedures, about the archive's policies. She was protecting him, he realized, even though doing so might cost her own career. They finally let him go at 7 in the evening. Margaret walked him to the parking lot, where the sunset was painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed too beautiful for the day he'd just endured. You should take some time off, she said. Paid leave, until this settles down. For your own safety as much as anything else. Margaret, I'm sorry. I never meant. Don't. She held up a hand. Don't apologize for doing the right thing. We both know that's what this was, even if it's going to be messy. Even if there are consequences. She looked older suddenly, worn down by decades of navigating the space between truth and secrecy. I spent 30 years in this business, Daniel. I've kept secrets I still can't talk about, things that might have been necessary or might have been crimes, I'll probably never know which. But Sapphire Sky? That was different. That was powerful people protecting themselves while pretending it was about national security. Will they come after you? Probably. But I'm close enough to retirement that it doesn't matter much anymore. She smiled, tired but genuine. Besides, someone had to make sure you didn't face this alone. Daniel drove home in a daze, his mind unable to fully process what had happened. When he got to his apartment building, Sarah was waiting in the lobby, her face streaked with tears. She'd seen the news. She'd put it together. The box, she said. That's what was in the box, wasn't it, The evidence. He nodded, and she wrapped her arms around him, holding on like he might disappear if she let go. The weeks that followed were a hurricane of media attention, congressional hearings, and legal maneuvering. Elena's story had opened a door that powerful people desperately wanted to close, but it was too late. Other journalists picked up the thread, finding new sources, uncovering additional documents. 2 of the officials she'd named resigned within days. The former NSA analyst who'd supposedly died of a heart attack. His widow came forward with evidence that his death had been suspicious, that there had been inconsistencies in the autopsy report that were never explained. Daniel testified before a congressional committee, answering questions about the declassification process, about what he'd found and how. He kept his answers factual, careful, avoiding any editorializing about what it all meant. But when a senator asked him directly whether he believed Project Sapphire Sky represented a breakdown in accountability, he didn't hesitate. "Yes," he said. "I believe that when we classify wrongdoing as a threat to national security, when we use secrecy as a shield for criminal behavior, we undermine the very institutions we claim to be protecting." The hearing room erupted in applause from the gallery, and the senator gavelled for order, but Daniel saw something shift in the faces of the committee members. Recognition, perhaps. Or shame. 6 months later, Daniel sat in a different coffee shop. He'd started varying his routines, a habit born from a paranoia he couldn't quite shake, reading Elena's follow-up article. The FBI had opened formal investigations into the surviving officials connected to Sapphire Sky. Congress had passed new oversight legislation, though Daniel suspected it had enough loopholes to be nearly meaningless. 3 people had been indicted, though whether any would actually face trial remained an open question. Theodore Raines's daughter had reached out to him through Elena. She was 43 now, a doctor in Seattle, and she'd spent 30 years believing her father's death was an accident. Now she knew better, and Daniel heard in her voice the same mixture of grief and vindication he felt himself, the pain of confirmation, the relief of no longer doubting what you'd always suspected. His phone buzzed with a text from Sarah, "Dinner tonight?" "I'm cooking." They'd moved in together finally, finding a place in Tacoma Park with hardwood floors and a small garden where Sarah planted tomatoes that actually grew. It was a new beginning, though Daniel knew he'd carry Sapphire Sky with him forever, the weight of it, the knowledge of what he'd helped expose and what still remained hidden. Because that was the truth Elena had taught him, for every secret that came to light, a dozen more stayed buried. For every Theodore Raines whose story was finally told, countless others remained forgotten. The architecture of silence was vast and deeply built, maintained by people who genuinely believed they were protecting something important and by others who simply wanted to protect themselves. Daniel closed his laptop and stepped out into the autumn afternoon. The leaves were turning, painting the streets in colors that would soon fall and decay and nourish the earth for whatever grew next. He thought about history, about the difference between what happened and what got recorded, about the archivists and journalists and ordinary people who spent their lives trying to close that gap. The truth had been classified as a threat, and in exposing it, he'd learned that some threats were necessary. That democracy required the risk of revelation, even when revelation was painful or dangerous or incomplete. He walked home slowly, watching people go about their ordinary lives, most of them unaware of what had been uncovered, what was still being fought over in courtrooms and hearing rooms and newsrooms across the city. The work would continue, it always did. New secrets would be made and buried and, eventually, found again by someone who believed that sunlight was worth the price of seeing clearly. The question that kept Daniel awake at night wasn't whether he'd done the right thing. It was simpler and more haunting: how many other Sapphire Skies were still out there, waiting in boxes that hadn't been opened yet, guarded by classifications that might never expire. He didn't know the answer. But he knew he'd spend the rest of his career looking.